Hey everyone, this is Zephyr with another video in our Foundry Basics series. This time on walls, their tools, their settings, and how to use them within Foundry. First, we'll go through the walls tools. The icon for it looks like a temple or the Parthenon here. Once you click on it, the subtool menu begins with the Select Walls tool. Then you have Draw Walls, which will place normal walls, terrain walls, invisible walls, ethereal walls, doors, secret doors, the clone walls tool, the force snap to grid toggle, and the clear walls button. We'll go through all of those settings in just a moment. You'll see that I've laid out all of these different basic types of walls, starting with normal, which is achieved by using the draw walls, terrain, and you'll see that there are two of those, invisible, which has this cyan color, ethereal walls, which are these dark purple walls. Then we have closed regular doors, locked doors, and finally, secret doors. We'll go over all of these types and what makes them different. First, by opening up the wall settings, we can see these different parameters. First, we have movement restrictions, which will be either normal or none. Sight restrictions, which go between normal, limited, and none. The same for sound restrictions. Wall direction, the is door state, and then door state. These settings are what differentiate these different types of walls. If we select a terrain wall here, we'll notice that the movement restrictions are normal, while the sight restrictions are limited. You can see that, again, the sight restriction and sound restriction options share the same menu. Invisible walls obstruct movement, but do not restrict sight. Ethereal walls are the opposite. They do not restrict movement, but do block sight. Doors do the same thing when they are in their closed state as a normal wall. You can select between closed, open, and locked for the state. And we can see that locked is a state selected on a door after it has already been drawn. There's not a direct tool for drawing locked doors. Finally, we have a secret door, which has the is door set to secret rather than true. Going through what these mean in a practical sense, I've set up stalls for demonstrating all of them. We'll start with the normal walls. You'll notice that my character cannot move forward, and they cannot see in this dark area where their vision is blocked. So everything behind this normal wall is hidden. You can see that from up close, the pitch black is where there's no fog. If I try to drag a character while I'm in a player view, I cannot drag through it. Terrain walls function differently. You can see as we move up, there's one layer of terrain wall here and a second back here. The first wall will not restrict vision in any way, but the second wall, once we see a second layer of limited vision restriction, it will block vision further. So that does not allow me to see beyond them. And again, I can't move past this because our movement restrictions are set to normal. Invisible walls function like windows or fences. They obstruct my movement, but not my vision. So I can see everything through that. We can also see that I am able to see both of these creatures on the other side, despite there being a terrain wall here. That is because I am only looking through one layer of limited vision rather than two. Next, we have ethereal walls, which are what I've used to create these little stalls here. Ethereal walls obstruct vision but do not block movement, so I can freely move between them, but I can't see past them. This is particularly helpful if you're setting up something like a curtain that will block someone's vision, but is not actually an obstruction to their movement. And again, we can't go through the invisible and normal walls, but we can walk right past any ethereal walls. Next, we have our first regular door. You'll notice that there is an icon over the door for a player's view that is identical to this closed door icon. When I step up to it, it blocks my vision and my movement. If I click on it, it will change the icon to an open one, and I can freely pass through it and see through the opening. Again, it is obstructed while it's closed, so I do have to have it in the open state to move through. A locked door for a player will show the exact same icon as a closed door, and it will still restrict their vision and movement. But you'll notice that if I click on it, there is a sound of a lock or struggling to open the door. And I cannot actually open this until the GM goes in and unlocks it. Now that we've come back with it unlocked, it still has that closed door icon, but now I can freely open it and go through it as I would a normal door. It is no longer locked. As a player, if there's a secret door, I have absolutely no idea where it is. There's this icon here that a GM would see, but I do not get to see that. As I move forward, it functions exactly like it is a normal wall. I can't move through it, it obstructs my vision, but if the GM opens it, it's as if there is absolutely no wall there. I do not see an open door icon or any other indication that there is a secret door there. From a GM perspective, you do get these same icons when you're in the token tool, where you have the locked icon, the closed door icon, and the secret icon. And just like a player, you can open the closed door. You can do the same with a secret door, but you cannot left click to open a locked door. Instead, you need to right click to unlock it, and then you can toggle through the state as normal. You cannot right click an open door to lock it. You must return to the closed state before locking it. Another important note is that you can lock secret doors without changing their status from secret. So if you right click this and lock it, your player still won't be able to see that, but you won't be able to just left click to open it. You'll need to right click to return it to the secret state and then left click to open it again. This is useful if you don't want to accidentally open a secret door. Now let's take a look at wall directions. If I open up my wall settings, I can go to the wall direction and specify left, right, or both. By default, they'll all be both. When I update the wall, you'll see there's now an icon with an arrow pointed towards a line. That is the direction in which the wall behaves as a wall. So when I switch to my character, we'll notice that I'm on the opposite side of that arrow. My sight is antithetical to that arrow. So here, it looks like there's absolutely no wall. But as soon as I cross this one-way wall, it is going to act like a normal wall again, and I can no longer move across it. As a GM, I'm able to drag the token, but if I was a player, I would get the error. And again, we can repeat this as many times as we want. This is useful if you want something like a trap or something that you can easily hop down but might not be able to climb up, such as a wall or cliff face. Now, we've seen that we can change the direction, but how do we determine that? Here you'll see I started at this lower point and then went up to this other point. You can kind of see this as creating a north-south axis, starting from your origin point. So because I went from down to up, that is going to be the north direction. And then to the right is going to be east, and to the left is going to be west. So I can kind of use that as a way to gauge what direction my walls are. So if I change my wall direction to right, that means that the wall is going to function like a wall from the right-hand side. And we can see that behavior matches up correctly. So that's how you can keep track of that. If I switch it to left, it will invert that. And we can change this back to both to have it function as a normal wall on both sides. Where this is mostly useful to keep in mind is that walls will have the same left and right depending upon the direction they are. So I've done both these walls from left to right. I'm going to do a third from right to left. Now, if I select all of these walls and apply the direction left to them, they're all going to be on the left side, but they have a different left. So that's important to keep in mind if you are, say, drawing several walls in a row for a cliff face and you want to set a direction. Make sure you're drawing them all from the same direction. Now let's get into lighting, what those sight restrictions were affecting in addition to token vision. I've set up this nice bright red light, and we can see if I select my token, I can't see the light beyond the wall. It peeks out over here where the wall ends, and it is completely blocked by this single wall. If we zoom out, and we can see the line that's indicating the total radius of the light. While we're in the light tool, we can see how it collides with these different walls and see where this light is bouncing. Obviously, you can tell really well with the color here where it is, but if you had a much more bland light color, this is useful for determining where tokens would actually have vision if they didn't have bright vision like my current token. We can see here that this is completely unobstructed because the light is only going through one layer of sight limited vision. But as soon as I move it over here, we can tell that from the direction of the light, it has to pass through two limited vision restricted walls. It's easier to see from down here, and we'll see that once the light hits that second limited restriction vision wall, it no longer passes through. Going over to the invisible walls, these have no sight restriction, and so the light can pass through as far as it wants, and we can add an infinite number of these invisible walls, and because they have no sight restriction, they are never going to obstruct the light. And we can verify that again by going back to the light. And then Ethereal functions exactly the same as the normal walls, and so we can confirm that it is only the sight restriction that affects the vision of lights and the passing through of light. So, when keeping vision and lighting in mind, the only thing you need to worry about is the sight restriction. They are linked together. There's not a separate setting for lighting. And then just to demonstrate with the doors, once you open them, then they let light through as if there is no wall there or there is no vision restriction. But when they are closed, they will have their same vision restriction state. Similar to lighting, we have sounds. I've placed a sound in place, and you'll notice that we have the same kind of radius that we see with lighting, and we can see where it is obstructed. And we can see where it passes through at the ends of the wall. Importantly, we'll notice over here, there is a section that is obscured because we're colliding with the terrain wall. If you recall when we were first setting this up, every single wall by default blocks sound completely. It has a full restricted sound restriction there. So, in order for it to pass through more, we're going to have to manually adjust those sound settings. If I go into these terrain walls and I also make their sound restriction to limited, then it will function similarly to how the walls with limited sight restriction work on lighting. And just for sake of ease, I will go ahead and apply none to the visible wall to demonstrate that as well. Notice I'm able to hear the sound using my preview, and we are able to see where that is. And when I move it down again, we pass through that first limited wall, but we stop on the second limited wall. And we can verify that once again with the preview sounds, and we can tell that going past the first wall doesn't actually create any volume easing either. It is purely based upon distance, and then it stops completely when we hit the second one. And again, this wall has no sound restriction, so we're able to move straight through. And finally, with the doors, this is a similar story to the lighting. They function according to their settings when they are closed, but as soon as we open them up, it is as if there is no sound restriction there. So you can use that, and we can verify that by going back to our sound tool and seeing the extent of that radius. As we've kind of demonstrated, it's really powerful to adjust the different settings of the walls, and you can adjust these settings after they're placed to create different combinations. For example, I can change this invisible wall into a door. That way it functions maybe more like a fence gate. That way it doesn't obstruct vision and doesn't obstruct movement, but it can be opened. And I can do the same thing with one of these doors. And again, maybe it's a fence gate or maybe it's a door with a large window on it. And you can create these different synergies between the various walls. So here again, we can see that while this door is closed, it still restricts movement, but it does not restrict vision. And then once I open it, it no longer restricts the movement. So you can use these different combinations to create custom wall types. They won't necessarily have the same color coding to them, but you will be able to achieve a lot of different powerful effects. While you're editing these, you need to take note of what all you have selected. I'm going to select all of these walls here, and if I want them to all be one direction and change the wall direction down to left or right, you'll notice that this wall configuration has normal set for movement, sight, and sound restrictions because my first one was there. When I apply this change, you'll notice that now all of these walls are normal walls that are one direction. They no longer have their individual settings. They've all been copied to be exactly like that first one. And we can verify this going through the token. So be careful what you have selected because it will copy all of those settings across instead of just the one you're adjusting. So make sure you're being specific and intentional with how you are selecting things. And I've kind of screwed up here, so I'm going to hit clear walls to remove these objects from the scene, and my walls that I messed up are gone. Now let's get into a practical example. I've dropped in a tile from the Bailiwiki modular towns, and this is a windmill from Abominable Rob that he submitted for a contest. And I'm going to draw in the walls for this scene. If I toggle in this force snap to grid setting, then whenever I'm placing my walls, it is always going to put the endpoint on a grid connection. Notice that if I grab this end node, it will move the wall. But if I hold control, then it will have me draw a new wall starting from that point. And I can use this to daisy chain walls. And as long as you're holding control, then it will continue to make walls. If you ever don't want a wall, just right click and you will cancel the placement. And you'll notice that this snapped into that end piece. And again, if I go through and I am placing it, it's going to force me to go to that nearest grid unit. If it is less than one grid unit long, or less than half of one grid unit long, it is going to not make a wall at all. If it's just over half, then it will jump to that next endpoint. For this curve, I'm not going to be able to use the snap to grid on it, and I'm going to have to make some judgment calls on where I want the wall to lie. Well, I've decided on my endpoint. You'll notice that if I go to click this point between these two wall segments, that I will only move the end of one wall. In Vanilla Foundry, you're not able to move multiple hinges on these walls. And if I select both of these, rather than moving that one point, I'm going to move the entirety of these two walls. So I am going to instead extend out the longer section of the wall to hit my endpoint. It's important for performance to have as few walls as possible. This doesn't mean don't make complex structures, it just means don't use 20 wall segments when one will do. And I, again, am not going to be able to use that snap to grid because it is frankly pretty ugly when you're trying to follow a curve if you have to be on those individual grid segments. And because these walls are going to restrict vision, it is going to be a lot more noticeable than if I was just restricting movement. So now I've turned my snap to grid off, and I am just going to start drawing out the walls for the curve and stopping at regular intervals. With organic shapes and curves, you're going to have to make a judgment call on how much you want exposed or how smooth you want the curve to be and how real to form you want it to be. You'll also notice that as I'm placing these endpoints are kind of jumping just ever so slightly from where I let go with my mouse. And to give you a better demonstration, as I move this end around and I find these different spots, it's going to then jump up. There are actually set increments of grid units that Foundry will snap to. I believe it is around 1/8 of a grid unit that it will stop at. And so if I'm trying to position something really precisely, then I need to hold down Shift like I can with other tools. And this will allow me to drop it exactly where I want it to be. And it's quite useful for really fine work. That being said, it is not fantastic for connecting walls together. It's also important to note that holding down Shift to bypass the micro snapping that happens with walls does not work for bypassing the force snap to grid toggle. Now I'm going to change this section into a door. Depending upon your workflow and the thing that you're working on, you might find it easier to just go ahead and draw all of your walls in as one type and then change the individual sections that you need. So I've changed a normal wall here into a door rather than drawing in a door by hand. Then when I'm trying to select something, you'll notice that this node gets large as I hover this, and both nodes are going to show up on the segment that you are currently working on. This is mostly useful when you are comparing between two types of wall that share a node here. So both of these are normal walls, and it's hard to tell which one I'm selecting if I'm picking that midpoint. Obviously with this door, the blue is easier to see. And if I'm trying to make sure I select the correct wall, I just need to hover over the middle part of it and then go back to the node to bring it to the front. When drag selecting, you'll notice that selecting the endpoints doesn't give you anything. You just need to select the middle point in your box. So if I drag this out, I don't have to worry about this really long wall being included because I'm nowhere near the midpoint, but I got the midpoint of all three of those sections there. This is useful to know when you're making different drag selections to make sure you're not grabbing anything you don't want. Now I'm going to go in and draw in my invisible walls. And you'll notice that this endpoint was slightly larger because actually the two nodes are barely offset because we use that shift trick to have things not quite on that micro grid. And you can really see it here where I use the shift click to move between. I can still have these points line up by holding down shift when I release it, and then it will actually stack correctly and join the nodes together. And then there, I kind of did it inadvertently, but if you have a section selected and you hold shift when you click on another one, then you will be able to add that single wall to your selection. And that's another way that you can select multiple walls. It's a little different if you're used to holding down Control or Command to select multiple things, but this shift trick is how you add incrementally to a selection. And this is true across all of the tools in Foundry. Now I'm just going to finish drawing in these invisible walls, and I'm using them as windows in this case. And then I will actually draw in this door. And I always really suggest when you are doing a different shape or a complex map that you bring in a token and you check the movement and see how it feels. There are times where you can get caught up on weird angles and sections, and you really don't want to find that out in the middle of a game session. So to demonstrate here, if say I have a wall that's kind of on an awkward increment within the grid unit, that's going to affect movement kind of strangely. I can't move through it, but I can see a little bit past it, and it's just a little strange. And sometimes this might even result in things being directional, like being able to move left or right over top of that wall. That restriction has seemingly become a little bit more strict as Foundry has gone on, but you can find yourself somehow going through walls that you can't go back over that aren't intended to be that way. So just double check with the token. Now let's take a look at an application for the one-way walls. You can see here that this area is lower and there's a clear setup of stairs that go up to up here by the millstone and a ladder that goes up to this walkway that seems to be flush with the area that the millstone is on. So those are probably at the same height or at least a step. And we can tell that there's not a railing between the two, so again implying that they're all at the same or very similar elevation. But this area down here is probably a little bit higher, or a little bit lower rather, than the rest of the area, and you might be able to hop down to it no problem from up top, but you probably can't climb up it without some kind of check or without it taking longer than your normal movement. So I drew in these invisible walls because this probably isn't going to obstruct vision, but it will obstruct movement here. And I am going to set this to a one-direction wall. Because I went from left to right on my first wall and then I maintained that directionality as I drew these, I can determine that left will have these sections act as walls from the lower area while functioning as just a free way to move when I get up top. So again, I'm up here on the slightly higher area and I can hop down no problem. But I have to go back up the stairs once I am down there. And as a GM, I can drag over that and I can hop down no problem, and I can use both entrances. So that's a way you can kind of create this feel of elevation even in vanilla Foundry without using additional modules to increase that feeling. And it really helps with the different immersion aspects here. And again, we have this sound restriction set up, and I might want to adjust that or change the sight restriction in case I did want this to feel like it was further down so that you couldn't actually see up until you were up there. But then people up above would be able to look down no problem. Here's a great example of where we might use a terrain tool. This shaft from the mill that controls the grindstone, it's kind of functioning like a column here. And with columns, even if you can't see past them, you can usually get a pretty good idea for how large they are just from the curvature of the architecture there. So I'm putting in these terrain walls, and we'll see that it obstructs what's behind the column, but I can still see exactly how large it is. And we can see the areas that are obscured where I wouldn't be able to see a token, etc. This is also useful if you want to be able to show off more of your map without necessarily giving more information to your players. Now that we've done that, I've placed in a sound that is for a grindstone. And we can tell that if we're inside of these terrain walls, we can hear it fine, but that doesn't really help us for being outside of it. So we're going to adjust this again. By default, all walls have a normal sound restriction. We want it to be either none or limited here. I'll go ahead and do limited in case I want to use some other kind of mechanism for limiting sound. But now we can see that the sound goes out properly, and we can see that it goes over that one-way wall, no problem, but over on the left side, as we're kind of moving around here, we'll see that on the left side there is this gap over here, and that is actually where it is hitting the solid face of this extra wall. So we're going to now adjust these one-way walls and give them no sound restriction, because again, they're small enough that they can obstruct movement, but not large enough that they obstruct vision or sound, and we'll see that now we have this full nice sound here. After you finish that, let's take a look at the Clone Walls tool. The last walls that I updated and actually made a physical change to or drew are these one-directional invisible walls. And if I have my Clone Walls tool selected, I will actually recreate that wall when I draw it. You'll see it has the same direction, same sound restrictions, same vision and movement restrictions as well. So this is a useful tool if you are going to use a very specific setup of wall repeatedly within a scene that maybe is not as practical to draw. So I'll start off with these different pillars here, and it's going to create a really nice effect with the lighting. But again, I don't want these to obstruct sound, so I'm going to go in and make the sound none and update it. And because that's the last wall I updated, when I use this Clone Wall tool, and I have to make sure I clear my selection, when I use the Clone Wall tool, it will draw terrain walls that have that same no sound restriction. And I can repeat this and do all of my columns like this all at once. Again, I really recommend that if you are using the Clone Wall tool, that you take care of all of the elements that use that same type of wall all at once. Otherwise, it can be a little tricky to go back and grab the right wall type, or it's easy to forget and mix up a setting between them. With all of our walls in place, we'll see that if we double click this cloned one, it does have that same no sound restriction. And that is true across all of these pillars. If I wanted to make adjustments to, say, the column from the windmill that actually powers the grindstone, I can use my box select to grab all of that and select it. I can also hover over this and hold Alt, and you'll see that all of the nodes of walls on the scene pop up. And if I hold that Alt and I click, it is going to select all of the walls that are connected. So all of these walls have their nodes touching each other. And that's useful if I need to drag everything around, or if they're all the same type, I can adjust a setting. And again, it's only ones that have their nodes connected. So even though these walls run into each other, because their nodes don't actually overlap, it's not going to select that as well. So that's another useful trick. Now that we've assembled this, I put in some lights and I have this token in here, and you can see these pillars create just such a fantastic shadow effect that really bring the space to life. And we haven't done a whole lot of crazy complicated things. This only took a couple of minutes to set up these walls like this. And we have this really nice, interesting scene that functions as you would expect the art to function. And we've got the lighting that just looks so crisp and the sound that looks so crisp. And with that, this is going to wrap up this episode of Foundry Basics. I hope that whether you are a seasoned pro with Foundry or a brand new user, that this video has been of some help to you. Whether it's teaching you something brand new or refreshing your memory about how a setting works. If you think that I missed something, have additional questions, or have an idea for the next topic that you would like to see me cover, please let me know in the comments down below. Thanks so much for taking the time to watch this. This has been Zephyr. Have a good one, and happy map making.